kid in Catholic school, and we had a guest speaker just for the boys. So we went out to the lunch benches, and the gentleman talked about the local football program. And he was so tough and so stern. I'll never forget, one of the things he said is, when you sign up, you're going to get out there, and you're going to work your butts into the grass. Well, I knew then I was not going to be playing football. But I'm glad I had the information to make that decision. I knew I didn't have what it takes to play football. But every now and again, you run into someone who looks at, say, the professional baseball players or the professional football players, or watches the Olympics and sees the professional gymnasts doing these amazing feats of dexterity and strength. And they say, wow, I'd love to do that. And you wonder how much naivete might be with that, especially it looks like a lot of fun to play professional baseball and play professional football. But then when one signs up for it, whether it be for Little League or whether it be the major leagues, and you see the conditioning that's involved, the exercise that's involved, the hard work to keep one's body fit that's involved, you wonder how many would survive such rigorous training to keep you fit enough to play what looks like a very fun game. How many would start and then say, well, I didn't know it involved this. I just thought it was the fun part of playing the game or performing the gymnastic feats. I didn't know that there was all this work, all this strain, and all this exhaustion that was involved in being a sports star. Well, in the same way, Jesus is basically saying, know what you're doing when you come and follow me. And how many places in the gospel does he demonstrate that? From those who build their house upon sand as opposed to build their house upon rock. From those in John's gospel who saw the multiplication of the loaves, obviously thought that providing lunch was very delicious, and followed Christ. And why? They kept saying, we want to see the multiplication again. Jesus acknowledged it. You're following me because you saw the multiplication of the loaves. But once he got into the true food, a food that scandalized them, the eating of the flesh and drinking of blood, they left. And in today's gospel, he is speaking in similar terms. Know what you're doing when you come and follow me. Nowadays, people look at Christianity and what do they see? Comfort, warm fuzzies, uplifting feelings, and love, 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 love. It's all about love. I like to tell the story of a gentleman who became Catholic, and he told me, Father, I didn't become Catholic because of the church's teachings. I became Catholic because Father so-and-so made me feel so uplifted and was such a nice guy. I said, really? Most of us join because of Christ. But the teachings are still important. To be a follower of Christ, we must live like we're followers of Christ. Even Jesus in some other places says, why do this? That's what the pagans do. You need to do what a follower of Christ does. And in today's gospel, he gives a whole list of what's expected of people. What they're expected to leave behind, what they're expected to do. And he doesn't say, if you do this, then you will be my disciple. He puts it negatively. If you don't do this, you cannot be my disciple. And what are they? Hate your father and mother. Now, is that to the extreme of actually hating your father and mother? Because after all, the commandment says, honor your father and your mother. He goes on, even one's own life. And what was he facing? Who was he preaching to? A generation that would eventually give their lives for the sake of the gospel. He's telling us we need to have our priorities straight if we are to be his disciples. How often do we see sometimes the most faithful Christian people, but the minute their children go into an illicit lifestyle, or grow lax in their faith, then their own resolve begins to wane a little bit. How often do people choose family over faith? Just to give one example. Or self over faith. How often people do cling to possessions, sometimes compulsively so, over the faith. This perhaps is one of the most challenging readings because Jesus is basically giving us the conditions of being a disciple. He's basically standing before us and saying, look, if you want me, here's what I expect. can't be a male or female gymnast without really working hard to keep yourself fit, including diet and rigorous exercise. You can't be a professional baseball or football player without physical fitness that will exhaust you to the point of dropping sometimes. You can't get to the fun of the game without keeping yourself fit enough to play the game. And you cannot be my disciple unless you know what it means to be a disciple of Christ and are willing to undergo that. We call that conversion. We call that conversion. And we hear that constantly throughout the Gospels. Lord, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, follow the commandments. Great, I do that. Well, you still have one more thing to do. Sell all you have, then come follow me. And the rich young man walked away unhappy. So what do the apostles say? Well, we've given up everything to follow you. And Jesus says, and you'll get it back 100 times, plus persecutions. He says this to a bunch of faceless cowards who abandoned him later on in the Garden of Gethsemane. It always seems that regardless of what people do, Jesus will never be satisfied. He may be pleased, but he'll never be satisfied, because he knows our human nature clings to things that pull us away from the gospel. And we are called to give up everything for that gospel. That must be the priority. That must be our first choice. Christ comes before everything, including father and mother, children, our own lives. And if we don't think we can do that, then perhaps we need to reassess, like the king and the builder in today's gospel, reassess our own personal resources so as to make an informed decision. We want to follow Christ, but do we have what it takes to be a follower of Christ? That perhaps may be the hardest decision any of us can make. And if we decide among ourselves we cannot do it, then the next question might be, what do we need to change so that we can? Jesus doesn't mince words, nor should we with ourselves. And we ask ourselves a simple question as we receive and ask the graces of this Eucharist. Jesus is very, very uplifting, very, very comforting. He offers us salvation and eternal life. He offers us the conquest of death and the resurrection from the dead itself. Do we have what it takes to follow him?